Hello there. Thanks for joining me here on Wicked Echoes. Your company today is greatly appreciated. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you would like to hear more content like this. It really makes a difference. Now let's crack on. My name is Marcus Del Rey, and I grew up in Jefferson County, West Virginia. My family has been in that part of the state since before anyone was keeping track of such things. I know those hills and those hollers better than most people know their own neighborhoods. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand I'm not someone who gets lost or spooked easily. I was 31 when this happened, working then as a contractor doing residential renovation work. A colleague of mine, older fella named Pete, mentioned a property he had been asked to assess. It was sitting on a wooded ridge about 2 miles east of the Appalachian Trail corridor near Harper's Ferry. The owner was trying to determine if the old farmhouse was structurally salvageable for a resale flip. Pete threw the job my way because he overbooked and the property was right in my area. I figured it'd be a quick half-day job. Look at the bones, take some photos, write a report, boom, paid. The access road was unmarked, but the owner had given me GPS coordinates and a gate code. I drove out on a Thursday morning in early spring, around the first week of March, I believe. The road climbed through second-growth hardwood forest for about 1.5 miles. It was the kind of morning where the fog was still sitting heavy in the low places between the hills. The house appeared gradually as I came around the final bend in the track. It was a 2-story wood-frame structure, probably built somewhere between 1890 and 1910 based on the style. The porch sagged badly on the left side and several upper windows were broken or missing entirely. This was all completely expected for a neglected rural property of that age and situation. What was not expected was the garden. Someone had recently planted a large rectangular garden plot directly in front of the house. Recently, meaning within the last several days. The turned earth still dark and loose looking. This was March in West Virginia. Too early for anyone sensible to be putting seeds in the ground. The frost risk alone would make it pointless, and the elevation here made it even more so. I stood beside my truck for a moment, looking at that garden, feeling uneasy about it. Finally, I shrugged it off, grabbed my clipboard, and walked toward the front porch. The front door was unlocked, not unusual for a vacant property of this type in a rural setting. Inside, the ground floor was gutted of almost all furniture. Bare wood floors coated in old dust. I noted the structural elements methodically, the beam conditions, the floor joists, the chimney situation. The house was drafty, but the main structure was actually more sound than I expected. I worked through the ground floor rooms efficiently and made my way to the staircase in the back. The stairs were solid, and I climbed to the second floor without any specific concern. There were 3 rooms up there, 2 small bedrooms, and what had been a larger sitting area. The first 2 rooms were empty and unremarkable. Same dust and neglect as the floor below. The third room, the larger sitting room at the front of the house overlooking the garden, that was different. Someone had been using it recently, within days, I would say based on what I found there. There were 3 wooden chairs arranged in a precise inward-facing triangle in the center of the room. On the floor, at that exact middle point of the triangle, someone had placed a small pile of soil, just loose garden soil, dark and fresh, matching exactly the color of the turned earth outside. A single candle stub sat melted onto the floorboards near one chair, recently burned down to nothing. The smell in that room was different from the rest of the house, earthy and faintly sweet. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, trying to construct a rational explanation for what I was seeing. Squatters can do some strange shit when they're on drugs. That was my first reach for normalcy. Local kids using the abandoned house for rituals of some teenage variety was my second reach for normalcy. Neither explanation sat right, because the chairs were old and matched the house's period of construction. They had not been brought in recently. They had been arranged recently, which was a different thing entirely. I took photographs of everything methodically because that is what the job required. Then I heard a sound from directly below me, from the ground floor I had just assessed and cleared. It was not a dramatic sound, not a crash or a cry or anything that would make a good story. It was the specific sound of a chair being dragged slowly across a bare wood floor. One deliberate drag, a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, and then another deliberate drag in a different direction. Like someone was rearranging furniture downstairs in a careful and considered way. I stood absolutely still on that second floor and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Twice, loudly and clearly. The dragging stopped mid-movement, and that particular quality of interrupted mid-action silence is something I will never forget. I waited, and I heard nothing more. So I made a decision that still embarrasses me somewhat. I didn't go back downstairs to investigate. I went out the second floor window onto the porch roof. I dropped from the porch roof to the ground, and I walked my ass back to my truck. I didn't run because something in me was absolutely certain that running would change things in a bad way. I got in, drove back down the access road, and pulled over once I reached the paved county road. My hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I sat there and I looked at the photographs I'd taken on my phone. The 3 chairs in the triangle were exactly as I'd photographed them. Nothing unusual in the images, except in the photograph of the small pile of soil in the center of the triangle. Something was wrong. In the photo, the soil pile was undisturbed, but there was a footprint at the edge of the frame that had not been there when I took the picture. A bare human footprint pressed into the loose soil at the outer edge of the triangle. Small, narrow, facing inward toward the center of the room. I know I had been the only person in that room when I took that photograph. I know what I saw through my own viewfinder, and I know what that photograph later showed. I reported it to the owner of the property, that the property had signs of unauthorized entry and recent habitation. He pushed back. He said the area was fenced, said it was probably just kids. I gave him my assessment of the structure's viability, sent the invoice, and never went back. I didn't tell anyone about the photograph for almost 2 years. When I finally showed it to my brother, he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he told me about something our grandmother used to say about certain properties in those hills. She called them listening houses, places where the ground had absorbed too much of something over time. She said the old families in those hills knew which properties those were and left them strictly alone. My grandmother was a practical, unsuperstitious woman who trusted concrete evidence over feeling. The fact that she held this one specific belief her entire life meant something to me when I heard it. I never found out who owned the property before the current seller or what had happened there. The house sat on the market for another 2 years before it was quietly taken off the listing. I checked the county records once, briefly, and then decided I didn't actually want that information. Some things are better understood as events you experienced rather than puzzles you try to solve. I drive past that access road turnoff sometimes when I'm working in that area. I have never once turned in, not even to look at the gate. The garden was the thing that stayed with me the most in the years after. Someone planted a garden there in early March with full knowledge that nothing would grow. Whatever they put in that cold ground, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they had been doing it long enough to make it a ritual, the kind of ritual that allows those who have passed on before us another chance to walk among us. My name is Samantha, and I was 34 when this happened to me last October. I had been section hiking the Appalachian Trail for about 3 years at that point. I was not a beginner who got spooked by deer crashing through the underbrush. I had done solo overnights in grizzly country out west without losing a minute of sleep. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand I'm not an easy scare. But what happened near Roan Mountain changed something fundamental inside me. I still can't sleep without the TV on, and I don't even think about my hiking gear anymore. I started that particular section on a Wednesday because I wanted the trail mostly empty. October in the southern Appalachians is gorgeous, and the leaves were at peak color everywhere. I parked at Carver's Gap and planned to hike south for 2 nights before looping back. The first day was absolutely perfect, and the balds were golden in the afternoon light. I set up camp near a tree line just off the trail around 5:30. There was nobody else around, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have that solitude. I ate my dinner, and I watched the sky turn purple over the grassy ridge to the west. I crawled into my tent around 8 and fell asleep, listening to the wind in the grass. I woke up sometime after midnight because the wind had completely and totally stopped blowing. That doesn't sound like much, but up on those balds, the wind never just stops. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire mountain around me. No wind and no insects. No rustling of any kind. Just absolute zero sound. I lay there in my sleeping bag. I could hear my own heart pumping in my ears. Then I heard footsteps, and they were coming from the tree line, maybe 80 yards away. They were slow and deliberate, and they were walking directly toward my tent. I wasn't scared yet because hikers sometimes come through late looking for a campsite spot. I unzipped my tent maybe 2 inches and looked out toward the trees across the bald. The moon was almost full, and I could see the grass pretty clearly in the light. Nobody was there, but the footsteps kept coming closer, and I could hear them getting louder. That was the first moment I felt something cold settle into my stomach, like gas station sushi. I could hear the grass being pressed down with each step, but nothing was making them. I zipped the tent back up, and I told myself it was some kind of acoustic trick. Sound carries weird on those mountain balds, and maybe someone was hiking a parallel trail nearby somewhere. I almost believed that nonsense, until the footsteps stopped right outside the front of my tent, and I could have reached through the mesh and touched whatever it was. I held my breath, and I waited. Then I heard something I can't fully explain. It was breathing, but it didn't sound normal. The rhythm was off, like a broken metronome. In, then out. Then a long pause, then 2 quick breaths. Then nothing for several seconds. No animal breathes like that, and no human I've ever met breathes like that. I had my flashlight in my hand, and every part of me wanted to turn it on. But something deeper than logic, my survival instinct, was telling me that turning on that light was making a mistake. Not just a piss-poor idea, but a mistake, like it would be crossing some kind of line. Like the light would make me visible to something that was navigating the forest without needing eyes at all. So I lay there in the dark, and I listened to that broken breathing pattern continue. After maybe 5 minutes, the breathing changed, and it started to sound almost like words now. Not English, not any language, but shapes of words, like someone just learning how mouths are supposed to work. Wet consonants that clicked, and vowels that droned too long, pauses in all the wrong places. I pressed my hand over my mouth because I realized I had started whimpering out loud. The moment I made a noise, the weird sound stopped immediately, like I had flipped some kind of switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the breathing, because it felt like I had its attention now. Whatever was outside my tent was not just standing there anymore. Now it was listening to me. I could feel it, the way you feel someone staring at you from across a crowded room. Except this felt heavier, and it felt like something was pressing against my thoughts from outside. I don't know how long that silence lasted because time stopped working properly for me. It could have been 5 minutes or it could have been an hour. I honestly can't say. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they were circling slowly around the tent perimeter, slow and deliberate, each step pressing the grass down right at the edge of my tent. One full circle, and then another full circle, then a third and a fourth. On the fifth circle, the footsteps stopped at the back of my tent, right behind my head. I heard the fabric of my rain fly move like something was pressing a face into it. Not a hand and not a paw, but a face, because I could make out the shape. It was too long and the proportions were wrong. Like a face reflected in a carnival mirror. The fabric stretched inward, maybe 3 inches, and I could see the impression of features pushing through. A forehead that kept going too far up. And where the mouth should be, it was way too wide. I stopped breathing entirely because my body had decided that being dead was safer than being noticed. And then it pulled away from the fabric and the footsteps resumed, heading back toward the tree line. Slow and deliberate, just like before, and the grass pressing down under invisible weight, step after step. When the footsteps reached the trees, they did not stop at the edge of the tree line. I heard them continue into the forest, and the sound changed from grass to leaves to sticks, farther and farther away until the sound dissolved into nothing, and the silence swallowed it all up. Then the wind came back all at once, like someone had released a breath the mountain was holding. Insects started up again, and a distant owl called. The world had turned back on around me. I didn't move until the sun came up, and even then I almost couldn't function. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work my tent zipper to get out. When I got outside, I looked at the grass around my tent, and it was pressed flat. A perfect circle of flattened grass around my tent, about 2 feet out from every side. 5 times around meant the grass was pressed down deep, and it had not sprung back up. I followed the trail of pressed grass toward the tree line and stopped after about 30 feet. The pressed path continued, but the grass along its edges had turned brown like a late frost. The green grass on either side was fine, but the grass in the path was dead already. I packed my gear in under 4 minutes, which is a personal record I never really wanted to set. I hauled ass as much as I was able to Carver's Gap, and I drove straight home, wide-eyed and shook. I told my sister about 2 weeks later, and she asked if I'd been drinking. I had not been drinking, and I don't take any medication. I was wide awake. I went back to Carver's Gap 6 weeks later during the daytime with my sister and her husband. I told myself I needed to see that grass had grown back and everything was normal. We hiked to where I had camped, and the grass circle was still there pressed flat, but the dead grass had spread, and the brown path toward the tree line was wider now. When my sister saw it, she got quiet and retracted her drinking statement. We left, and I have not been back, and I will never set foot on that trail again. Sometimes at night, when my house gets really quiet, I think I hear that broken breathing pattern. In, then out. Then a long pause. Then 2 quick breaths. Then nothing for several seconds. I tell myself it's the furnace, or the refrigerator cycling, or the house settling into itself. But the thing is, I only hear it when I'm lying down, alone, in the dark. My name is Dolores Whitfield, and I am 53 years old. I've been hiking seriously since my late 20s, over 2 decades of trails. I have done sections of the Appalachian Trail through Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina multiple times. I can tell the difference between trail disorientation and when something is genuinely, profoundly wrong. What happened to me on the Roan Highlands section happened in late October, 3 years back. The weather had been strange all week. too warm for that elevation and that time of year. I was solo hiking a 4-day stretch starting near Carver's Gap in Tennessee. The first day was unremarkable, beautiful even, with the grassy balds stretching golden in every direction. I set up camp just below the tree line on the second evening, around mile marker 12. That night, I woke up with what my watch said was exactly 2:47 in the morning. There was no sound, which was actually the problem. I have camped enough to know that complete silence in an Appalachian forest at night is unusual. No insects, no distant owl calls, no wind moving through the spruce fir canopy above me. Just total, almost pressurized silence, like the air itself was holding its breath. I lay still inside my tent for several minutes, listening as hard as I could. Then I heard it for the first time, and I can't describe it without sounding foolish. Someone was counting out loud in the darkness somewhere downhill from my tent. Not whispering, not shouting, just speaking at a completely ordinary conversational volume. The voice was a man's voice, low and unhurried, somewhere between 40 and 60 years old. He was counting by ones, slowly, with a pause of maybe 3 full seconds between each number. 41, pause. 42, pause. 43. That rhythm, that deliberate patience, it was somehow the worst part immediately. I told myself it was just another hiker, maybe someone having a medical episode or sleepwalking. I unzipped my tent slowly and looked out with my headlamp for any movement. The trees downhill were dense and the slope dropped away sharply into the complete darkness. I couldn't see anyone, but the counting continued without interruption at the same steady pace. 57, pause. 58, pause. 59. I called out. I said, "Hello?" I said, "Are you okay out there?" The counting stopped immediately the moment my voice left my mouth. That sudden silence after was so complete, it felt physical, like a pressure change. I waited for maybe 5 full minutes, completely frozen at the opening of my tent. Nothing moved and nothing made any sound. I told myself whatever it was had moved on, maybe a confused local out there somehow. I zipped my tent back up and lay there with my heart doing cartwheels in my chest. At some point, I must have fallen back asleep because my alarm woke me at 6. In the gray morning light, I felt embarrassed about how frightened I had been. I packed up and started hiking and told myself the story was already over. That was a mistake. By mid-morning, I had climbed back up toward the high bald section near Round Bald. The views were extraordinary, so I stopped to eat a granola bar at a rocky overlook and enjoy nature's beauty. That's when I noticed the cairn. Now, trail cairns are common. They're stacked rocks that mark routes, nothing unusual about them in principle. But this particular stack of rocks was positioned at the very edge of a steep drop-off. The stones were not the flat, broad hiking trail variety people typically use for trail markers. They were smooth and rounded, like creek stones, pulled from somewhere far below and carried up. There were exactly 60 of them. I only know that because I counted them without really thinking about it, the way you sometimes do when your ADHD goblin shows up for no reason. I stood there in the wind for a long moment, staring at that number of rocks, 60 stones, and the voice the previous night had stopped somewhere in the late 50s. That recollection alone had me a bit bothered, but I soldiered on anyhow. I kept hiking and made camp that night about 6 miles further along the ridge. I didn't sleep very well that second night. The counting started again at the same time. 2:47, my watch confirmed it, is when I snapped awake to that terrible patient voice. This time, it was much closer, maybe 30 yards from my tent, and this time he started at 61, exactly where he would have left off the night before. This time, the temperature outside started to drop with every stone he placed. The fear that ran through me was so intense I couldn't move. There was no way I could open my tent that night, not even if I wanted to. I lay completely rigid, and I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep quiet. The counting continued for what I measured at 42 minutes before the silence returned. In the morning, the counting had reached somewhere around 117. I was almost frozen solid, or at least that's what it felt like for about an hour, until I was warm enough to get my shit together, both mentally and physically. I know that I experienced something in those highlands. I have no clue as to what it was, though, and I know how all this sounds. But if you camp on the Roan Highlands in late October, listen carefully, and if you hear a man's voice counting in the dark from somewhere downhill of your camp, stay inside your tent. Don't call out. Don't let him know that you're aware of him. Because I know that if you interrupt the counting of the cairn stones, you damn well might freeze to death. My name is not actually Dale, but that's close enough for what I need to share with y'all. I have lived in these mountains my whole life, and my family goes back 7 generations here. My grandfather told me things about these hollers that I thought were just old man stories growing up. He said there were places in the woods where the ground remembers things that happened before people arrived. He said some of those places are thin, and things can move through them in both directions. I thought he was just trying to keep me out of certain parts of his property as a kid, but it turned out he wasn't telling stories. He was speaking the truth. It was March of 2019, and we had just come through an ice storm that knocked out power for days. I was checking my property line for downed trees because my neighbor and I share a fence line. The woods on my land back up against Federal Trail corridor land, and I know every inch of it. I know where every old foundation is, and where the moonshiners used to run. I have walked those woods in every season for my entire life, and I have never been lost. That morning, I found a tree down across my fence line, and I brought my chainsaw to cut it up. While I was working, I noticed something maybe 50 yards deeper into the woods on the federal side. There was a clearing that I had never seen before, and I have walked past that spot hundreds of times. Not a new clearing from the ice storm, but an old one with short dead grass and bare dirt. The trees around its edges were standing, but their bark was stripped clean on the sides facing inward. White bare wood facing the clearing in a perfect circle like the trees had been peeled by hand. I turned off my chainsaw and I just stood there looking at it for a while. My grandfather had described something exactly like this, and he called them by a word I will not repeat. He said they appear and disappear, and if you ever find one, you walk away and don't look back. I should have listened to my grandfather, but I was a grown man now, and I was curious and stupid. I walked into that federal land, and I approached the clearing. I stopped at its edge first. The air was different there, and I know that sounds like something a crazy person would say. It was warmer by at least 10 degrees, and the ground was not frozen, even though everything else was. The dirt in the clearing was dark and wet, like it had rained there recently, but nowhere else. I stepped into the clearing, and the sound changed immediately, like I had walked into a room. The woods around me were still visible, but they sounded muffled, like hearing the world through a thick wall. I looked down, and the dirt under my boots was soft, and it was warm through my soles. Then I noticed that my shadow was pointing the wrong direction, and my skin went completely cold. The sun was to my east because it was morning, but my shadow was pointing east as well. I was casting a shadow toward the light source. Last time I checked, that's not how shadows work at all. I looked up at the sky through the clearing, and the sky was right. Normal. but the light was coming from everywhere at once, and my shadow should not have existed at all. I stepped back toward the edge of the clearing, and my shadow moved, but it moved too late. Like there was a delay of a half of a second between my movement and my shadow following behind me. I stepped forward again and watched my shadow. It caught up to me a beat too late. Then I did something that still wakes me up at night about 3 times every single week. I waved my hand and I watched my shadow, and my shadow waved, but it was not my wave. The motion was similar, but the fingers were wrong, and the shadow had too many of them. Not 5 fingers, but 7 or maybe 8. And they were longer, and they moved independently of each other. I looked at my own hand in front of my face, and it was my normal hand with 5 fingers. I looked back at my shadow, and the shadow hand was still up, and it was still waving at me. But I had already put my hand down, and the shadow had not followed this time at all. My shadow was waving at me on its own, and I was standing completely still, watching it happen. I can't even begin to describe the feeling that went through my body at that moment. Every cell in me understood something that my brain refused to process, and my legs almost gave out. My shadow lowered its hand slowly, and then it did something that makes me sick to remember. It tilted its head, and the shadow head tilted at an angle no human neck should allow. Almost 90 degrees to one side, like a dog hearing a strange sound, but much further and disturbing. Then the shadow started to change shape, and it wasn't my shape anymore at all. It was still connected to my feet, but above the feet, it was becoming something taller and thinner. The head shape elongated. The arms multiplied, and I mean that literally. My shadow had 4 arms, and they were all moving slowly like seaweed, waving in a gentle current. I was frozen, and I couldn't move because my body had disconnected from my brain entirely by that point. Then the shadow took a step. I was standing still. The shadow was moving independently now. It stepped forward, away from me, which meant it stepped toward the center of the clearing on its own. The connection to my feet stretched like taffy, and then it snapped. My shadow was freestanding now, a dark shape on the ground, moving on its own, walking slowly toward the center of the clearing. When it reached the middle, it stopped, and the dark shape on the ground began to rise upward, like someone was pulling a blanket up from the ground, and it was becoming 3-dimensional and standing up. My shadow was standing off the ground and becoming something solid and dark, tall and real. That's when my legs finally unlocked. I broke into a sprint. I have never run like that before. I ran through the woods and I hit branches. I fell twice and I cut my face open. I made it back to my fence line, left the chainsaw, and I ran to my truck. I drove home, and when I got inside, I locked every door and window in the house. I sat in my kitchen with every light on, and I didn't move until my wife came home. She found me sitting at the table with the kitchen knife in my hand, staring at the wall. I told her I had fallen in the woods and cut my face, which was technically not a lie. I didn't tell her about the clearing because I don't know how to tell anyone anything. What words do you use to tell someone that your shadow detached from your body and stood up? There's no way to say that to another person without sounding like you have lost your mind. I went back to that spot 1 week later because I had to know if the clearing was still there. I brought my dog this time because I thought my dog would react if something was genuinely wrong out there, and I'll be damned. My dog would not go past the fence line, and he has never refused to go into those woods before. He planted his feet and he whined. His hackles stood up and he looked at me like a warning. So I went alone and I walked to where the clearing had been. It was not there anymore. The trees were normal and the bark was intact. There was no clearing and no bare dirt at all. But I found one thing that made my knees buckle. On the ground, where the center of the clearing had been, a dark patch on the forest floor, in the exact shape of a person standing with 4 arms. It was not a trick of canopy light, and it was not a dark patch of soil or rock. It was a shadow, and it was darker than any shadow I have ever seen in those woods. I watched it for about 10 seconds, and then one of the arms moved. I hauled ass. I told my wife eventually about 5 years later, and she listened. She didn't call me crazy, but she started sleeping with the hallway light on, and she's never done that before. I told 2 friends from church, and one of them stopped calling me, and that was that. The other one got very quiet. Then he told me his father had seen a clearing like that. Same strip bark and same worn ground, and his father found it near Dolly Sods in the 1960s. His father never went into the clearing though, because his father listened to his own grandfather. His father was smarter than I was, and I think about that difference almost every single day now. I still live here, and I still walk my property, but I don't go past the fence line anymore. Sometimes in the late afternoon, when the sun is low, I check my shadow very carefully before going outside. I count its fingers, and I watch it move. I make sure it does exactly what it's supposed to. So far, it has behaved itself. But there are days when I think it moves just slightly too late. A fraction of a second behind me, like it is choosing to follow instead of being forced to follow. I don't know what I stepped into that day in the clearing, and I don't reckon I ever will. But my grandfather was right about those hollers, and I should have listened to him when I was young and smart. Some ground remembers things from before people. Some of those things are still down there waiting underneath.